Welcome to QX Church. Find us online at qxchurch.org, and I am Pastor Scott Conway, talking about decisions. How do people make decisions? This is lesson number 4 in the series, and of course we've been discussing for the last 3 lessons in this series how people make decisions, and then the basic idea that people make every choice they make by choosing from a menu of options. And specifically this time we're going to talk about the idea of a decision is a selection from a perceived menu of options. We're going to break that out in more detail. And we're going to talk about how people make all the choices. Now, a lot of people think that they make good choices. And they think that they make choices in general, but there's a way that the menu is crafted and a default system that is built into us as to how we make these decisions that tells us that most of the decisions we do not make big picture. We do not make on a philosophical level. Now, I'll tell you for myself, and I suspect I'm not the only one in this category, because this, I believe, applies to every single human being, is that if you looked at every choice you made in your life, every word that you utter, the reactions you have to people, the choices that you make in the activities you engage in, and you made every single decision from big picture thinking, you are very philosophical as you approach things, you would probably make some of your decisions differently. In my particular case, I would definitely make some of my decisions differently. Some of them I might have to tweak just a little bit. Some of them I might have to do very, very differently. Some I might even have to do opposite. Very few decisions we make, we actually are doing the optimal thing for our long-term best interests. Now, here's one of the things to consider. We've already talked about the spirit, soul, body model, and that what is best, what you choose as your best option, what you believe to be your best option, will vary based upon where in the chart you are. So you're talking about your physical body. If you're talking about your physical body, what will feel good right now? Well, what might feel good right now is that really tasty treat. What might feel good right now is that really big, nice plate of food. And no given dessert, no given dinner, no given buffet inducing a food coma is going to make you unhealthy, is going to make you fat, unless there's something toxic in it that gets you sick. But a habit like that might make you feel pleasure in the moments that you're eating, but long term you'll be very unhappy with your body. On the other hand, having a disciplined diet, having a disciplined exercise regimen in any given moment may not necessarily feel as good as it might feel to have that delicious dessert, to entertain yourself at the buffet. And I love my buffets, to be perfectly honest. I love my buffets. But I know if I had a buffet for breakfast, a buffet for lunch, and a buffet for dinner, and that my primary focus at every single one of those meals is let me have everything that will make my body feel good right now in the moment, everything that will be tasty, everything that will make me feel filled and full, that boy, would that be bad for me long term. Now, what would be great for me long term is this disciplined routine of focusing on my exercise, making my exercise choices to build the physique that I want, to develop the fitness that I want, to develop the health that I want, the eating habits, and we do all of that. And just on where you are on the chart, are you on a higher philosophical level, looking down at your body, or are you in a moment looking at your body? And so what you perceive as best is going to vary based upon where you are. What you perceive as best is going to shift and ebb and flow depending upon the role you come from. That's Miles' law that we already talked about. And we're going to get into this time, how is this selection made? Because sometimes when you look at the choices people make in their life, you're just baffled. Why would they do that? I don't get it. Why would people react that way? And even worse than this, why would people react that way and then go with it? Why would people attack the people that they love? Why would people not do the thing that's healthy for them? Why would people do damage to the relationship, damage to their own body, sometimes making incredibly toxic, unhealthy choices, go keep working a job that's slowly killing them, engage in various physical habits that is damaging to their body? Why do people do these things? And of course, the context we're looking at all of this in is why do people reject Christ? And why do people accept Christ? Why do people take the next step in discipleship? Why do people reject the next step in discipleship? Why do people step up and be more loving, and why do some people not? How come some people step into Christ and they become more judgmental? All of these things are choices people are making on an autopilot system designed and engineered into us that we are to take control of. The default settings aren't there because they're mature. The default settings are there for our survival. And we're expected to grow up and grow beyond these things, but honestly, many of us, I'd venture to say none of us, certainly not me, ever gets completely past all of these things. But if we understand them, if we can see them in operation, not only can we understand other people, not only can we understand why someone is rejecting Christ, not only can we better understand why someone won't take the next step of discipleship, why someone will choose to read the Bible, someone else won't choose to read the Bible. Someone will make it a daily habit to pray, and some people won't make it a daily habit to pray. For some people, the daily habit of prayer never gets past praying for a meal, and that's it. Why some people choose to fellowship, some people choose not to fellowship. Some people study their Bible, some people don't. Some people read the whole book, some people just pick and choose their favorite verses and passages. Why do people make all of these choices? And of course, specifically, we're talking spiritual choices, the choices for or against Jesus Christ, for or against your growth as a Christian. Why do people do this? But the exact same decision-making processes we're talking about today apply to all decisions that everybody makes on every single thing. So all decisions are selections from a perceived menu of options. So whatever that menu of options is, we're going to get into that in a moment. But this is how the selection is made. So it is a selection from a perceived menu of options. The selection is made by the first applicable of these four. Number one, people will make their decisions based on survival. So the first thing that kicks in is live or die. It's the survival need. If it is unaffected by a survival need, then it goes to emotion. How do I feel about this? And the more intense the emotion, the more clean and clear that decision is right here, right now, in this moment. If the emotion is somewhat ambivalent, if there's a I want to, but I don't want to, and I kind of like to, but I'm not really sure, and you're kind of in between emotionally, then logic kicks in. Also, logic will kick in if you're kind of ambivalent about it emotionally. Like, I don't really care. Let's take a look at this. And when you really have no opinion, that emotionally it just doesn't matter to you. Yeah, we do it, we don't do it, whatever, it doesn't really matter to me. Then you're looking at it by logic. Now, sometimes logic doesn't give you an answer. Sometimes there's pros and cons. So say if you have two job offers, one has more benefits, one has less benefits. But the one with more benefits has less pay, and the one with less benefits has more pay. Or maybe you have one job opportunity, it is your dream job, but in order to take this dream job, you're going to have to move, and you really don't want to move. You kind of want to stay here. And all these things will begin to factor into it. So logically, when you begin to look at something, there's so many pros and cons that if you did a variation of what's called an old Ben Franklin, there's two ways to do a Ben Franklin. I'm going to tell you the traditional way, don't ever do the traditional way. And I'm going to tell you a updated modern way to do a Ben Franklin. Now here's what a Ben Franklin is. You put the thing across the top of your page. You draw a line down the middle of the page. One side is pro, one side is con. One side is why you would do something, one side is why you wouldn't do something. Now, the old Ben Franklin system is like when you start writing down the reasons why you would and the reasons why you wouldn't, and then whichever list is longer, that tells you what your decision is. Well, that's not necessarily going to be the case because it's not necessarily individual line items. The power of making the choice just on the longer list, that tells you how you're chunking. So say if the thing over here is it pays $100,000 a year, that's the pro. And the con is, it's 75 miles away. If we don't move, I'm going to be commuting 2 hours each way. And, that means a car expense, and that means, and you start making all this as like, well, this thing already has 7 things already, that only has the one, so I'm not taking the job. But that one might be more important. That one might be the only offer you have on the table that pays enough money to finance everything you need to do. So the way to do a Ben Franklin in kind of the modern weighted sense, in the kind of 4P 360 way, is you look at the pros and the cons and what the purpose of breaking this out is. We're going to get into brainstorming later to really look into some of these things. And you say, okay, what are the pros, what are the cons, and then you weight them by importance. You just make the Ben Franklin list so you can see what the pros and the cons are. And you might take note that none of these cons outweigh the pro. Yes, all of these things, that's an inconvenience, it's inconvenience, it's inconvenient, it'll take more time, it'll be more expensive. You know, if I'm commuting 2 hours each way, I'm not going to have an 8-hour workday plus a short commute. I'm going to have an 8-hour workday plus a long commute. That's going to take up 12 hours of my day. The average person's commute might be 20 to 40 minutes. Mine's going to be 2 hours. Is that enough to say no to $100,000? And you're like, nope. How about possibly needing a new car, the gas expense? Is any of this stuff enough to say no to $100,000? Is all of this together enough to say no to $100,000? And so by weighing the sides, now you can ascribe a numerical value, that's one way to do it, or you can just kind of weight them as A, B, C, D, and kind of grade them. And some of them you look at as like, well, yeah, technically that's a con, but it's really not all that relevant. Scratch it out. Ignore it. So, it's there, but I really don't care. It's really not going to make that much of a difference. Some stuff might make a bigger difference, and as you break out your list, you might find some stuff you didn't think about before. But that's the more modern, updated way to do a Ben Franklin. And that's supposed to be a logic system. So they use the first applicable. When you're making a decision, you're making a selection from a perceived many of options. The selection is made from the first applicable, number 1 of survival, number 2 of emotion, number 3 of logic, and you only get to the next one if the one before doesn't do it for you. And then, if logic doesn't make the decision for you, then it goes to philosophy. That philosophy is like, what are the principles you use? What are your values? What is your big picture? Not what's your calculation on this, but what is your big picture? And when you begin to look at things kind of big picture, now you're looking at larger things. But most people really only get to the philosophical considerations if logic hasn't made the choice for them. And they only get to logic if emotion hasn't made the choice for them. And they only get to emotion if survival hasn't made the choice for them. So survival, what is a survival need? Now survival, obviously if it's live or die, I mean we get that. If you're going to live if you do one thing and you're going to die if you do another thing, well the choice, generally speaking, sounds like it's pretty obvious. Interestingly enough, it's not. Sometimes people will make a choice that literally gets them physically killed because something else is more important to them than their survival. Here's a basic definition of survival. It is, I have to, or I can't. I have to, or I can't. So when someone feels, well, I have to do this, that means to them it's a survival thing. They're not doing it because I want to do this. They feel they have to do this. They feel that it's a must for some way, shape, or form, that their survival in some literal or metaphorical sense hinges on whether or not they do this. I can't is exactly the same thing, just in the opposite direction. I can't do this. That if I do this, it's going to cost me something I'm not willing to lose. It's a survival need, literally or metaphorically, in some way, shape, or form. So I heard a story. A gentleman was in Africa, on a mission field, in a predominantly Muslim area. And he had been speaking to this man that he had developed a relationship with over time. And the missionary really felt this person was ready to accept Christ and talk to him about it. And his African friend told him, I believe what you were telling me. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and the Savior. But you have to understand something. My nation is Muslim. My family is Muslim. My business associates are Muslim. If I accept this Christ you are telling me about, I will lose my family. I will lose my business. I will be ostracized in my nation. And while I believe what you say is true, I cannot accept what you say and accept your Christ because it will cost me too much. Now think about this for a moment. If he had been in America, what is the price you pay in America for accepting Christ? Basically nothing. What is the price you pay in an American church for accepting Christ? Absolutely nothing. They praise you, they'll applaud you, they'll help you. But what is the price he would have paid? How many of us are committed enough to Christ they say, I will surrender my family? Someone said, it's Christ or your family. How many of us would lose our family? How many of us would lose our nation? How many of us would lose our income? How many of us, don't just have that emotional, well, I would never deny Christ. Someone else said that 2,000 years ago and did it 3 times that night. And he was passionate. He had even drawn a sword against a Roman legion to defend Jesus earlier that night and denied him 3 times. So that initial reflex, I have to tell you, even for myself, there's a line at which point I suspect I would probably be willing to deny Christ. And part of it, I figure Peter denied Christ. So you got to figure there's a line. Now the curious thing with Peter, and I don't know how much different I would be likely to be, probably not much at all, is Peter was so committed to Christ that when the Roman cohort came for Jesus, he drew his sword and was ready to fight. And not just hypothetically ready to fight, he moved in and attacked. That's commitment. But then later on, standing around a fire, when a servant girl asks, oh wait, you're Galilean, aren't you with Christ? No, I don't know the man. He's willing to stand up to the Roman legions, but he's not willing to admit his faith to a girl around a campfire. Because he could have been arrested. In fact, he just attacked the Roman legion. He could have been arrested, tortured, put to death, and he denies Christ. Just like Jesus warned him he would, to which he says, I would never deny you. I will be faithful to you even unto death. And drawing a sword in the Roman legion pretty much showed that. And denying him 3 times that night kind of shows Jesus kind of knows us better than we know us. So I have a pretty strong suspicion I'm probably in the same boat that Peter's in. Probably not going to be like John. John, stuck by faithfully the whole time. I'm more like Peter. And so I suspect that there's a line at which I would probably deny Christ. And I'm not going to pretend that there isn't. As much as, hypothetically, you might like to think that there isn't. Just remember, this is Peter. This is the guy who, at Pentecost then, would preach the sermon that would convert 3,000 people. This is the man who was given the keys of the kingdom. This is the guy. This is the one disciple that walked on water. One of the inner 3. And he denied Christ. So I suspect there's probably a line at which I would deny Christ. I don't think I'm probably going to be much better than Peter. I have a pretty strong suspicion, as a matter of fact, I'd be much, much worse than Peter. But you have survival needs. You have emotional needs. But when you're talking about the survival need, I have to, or I can't. That man was convinced enough that in a vacuum with no other factors, he would have said, okay, I am adequately convinced to accept. But he wasn't adequately convinced to pay that kind of price. He wasn't adequately convinced to die financially. He wasn't adequately convinced to die in his family. He wasn't adequately convinced to die socially. He wasn't so convinced that he would pay this enormous price to accept Christ. I have to or I can't. If the matter is one of survival, survival needs overwhelm all else. If this man had another way to make a living, if this man would not lose his family, lose his culture, lose his country, be cast out of everything else he held dear, he was already there. He needs to be much more convinced because you have to overcome that survival need. So if the matter is one of survival that will overwhelm all else, it may be physical survival. That's the obvious survival. It could be social survival, like we were just talking about. For some people, their social standing is so important that they will do anything to protect it or to achieve it. Financial survival. Again, some people will do all kinds of things to protect their finances or to achieve their finances. Relational survival, keeping a particular friendship going, keeping a family going, keeping a marriage going, keeping even a boyfriend-girlfriend romance going. The survival of identity. Now this one is a tricky one because this gets us sometimes. Sometimes we face situations where we have tremendous anxiety about something. We may not know what it's from. But that tremendous anxiety that we have could be an identity issue. That to you, this is who you are. One of the most interesting survival of identity situations I personally ran into is I was working with a woman, and it's kind of step by step we were kind of working some things through, and she finally reached a point of crisis where things had gotten so good in her life, she'd gotten so on top of things, her relationship with her husband was amazing, and they had gotten so close and so intimate, she says that it was like she's saying, come here but stay back, come here but stay back. And they'd never been so close to kind of activate that part in her. And what she realized is that she had a lot of fear. And in fact, this is a woman who had made tons of her life decisions out of fear. This is someone who had governed her family out of fear, who had instilled fear in her children. She had a child who was, 10, 12 years old at the time, and he was going to be home by himself for a little while until his dad showed up. He was old enough to be at home by himself, wasn't anything all that dangerous. And he was given strict instructions, do not eat anything until your father gets home. And Dad was hours away. Now, she didn't know Dad was hours away. She thought Dad was going to be home within the hour, but it turned out Dad wasn't home for over 4 hours. So, this hungry kid didn't eat anything. And some of us wanted to know. It's like, well, just out of curiosity, why was he under such strict instructions to not eat anything before Dad got home? Because there can be reasons for that, depending on what it is, and the food needs to be prepared, and it might not be safe, or if it has an allergy, and he's not always the best judge of what he is or isn't allergic to. But no, not a special needs kid, normal, healthy child, no allergies. This was the instructions. Like, if he starts to choke, he doesn't know what to do. So I don't want him eating unless there's an adult there to supervise him in case he chokes. Now, of course, some of us wonder, well, you've had a lot of kids. How many of your kids have ever choked, like needed help level of choking? Because, well, none. But it could happen, and I don't think he knows what to do. That's the level of fear that this woman lived in, that she used to make and govern her decisions. So when she got to this place where now she could let go of the fear and act out of wisdom and love instead of out of fear. And she said, I don't know if I'm ready for that. She was afraid to not be afraid. Because this fear was such a core element of her identity that she didn't know who she would be if she wasn't afraid all the time. She was afraid to not be afraid. That's survival of identity, or any other form of survival. So you can clearly see it's not necessarily physical survival. It could be metaphorical survival. She had so carefully identified with this way of doing things. She had so carefully identified with past trauma. She had so carefully identified who she is that she couldn't let go of this thing that was doing damage in her life because it was a survival need. Now, if it is not perceived as a survival matter, then decisions are made emotionally and justified logically. That is, when you think you're making a decision logically, you really aren't. You're making the decision emotionally. You're using logic to justify it, but you're deciding on emotion. And it's when emotions do not apply, or they're in balance or in tension, then logic becomes a factor. So this is the normal default setting. So the way the emotions work, basically we are pleasure-pain creatures, that we seek out pleasure, we seek to avoid pain. Seeking to avoid pain is a much bigger reflex than seeking to pursue pleasure. And so when you have something you think is going to hurt you, when you have something you think is going to do damage to you or is doing damage to you, there's a tendency to recoil from that. When you have something that you want, something that you like, you'll tend to draw toward that. But pain is 4 times more powerful than pleasure. That's our standard formula. The negative is 4 times more powerful than positive because that tells you something needs to change. And so it needs to stand up and flash, hey, 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 pain, negative, fix this, avoid this. And so when you're dealing with this pleasure-pain dynamic, you understand that that's how all emotions are working. At the basic level, emotions are emotions of change, negative, painful emotions, or emotions of duplication. I like that. Let's do more of that. And when you understand just that much of the language of emotions, then you can see how emotions are working in you. So when you see something you want or something else you don't want, then the logic kicks in. Well, how do we justify it? How do I explain why I'm avoiding this thing I don't want so that it sounds like it makes sense? And I can do this thing that I do want and make it sound like it makes sense. Now, when you do it at an extreme level, we call it rationalizing. And, rational lies, the lies we tell ourselves to make something seem rational. Now, so when the emotions do not apply, or they're in balance, which meaning that, well, it's kind of even on both sides, or in tension, which means you have a draw to both things simultaneously, or you have an aversion to both things simultaneously, or everything on your menu kind of equally, then philosophy kicks in, or then logic kicks in. And if logic doesn't clearly dictate an answer, then it comes down to personal philosophy, which includes your values, your priorities, your principles. Now, here's your ideal, though, in all of this. Your ideal is to balance all 4. Lead with philosophy. What are my values? What are my priorities? What are my principles? If you're a spiritual person, what are the spiritual principles that apply? If you're a Christian, what's Jesus' will for this? Even if you're a generic deist, like what's God's will for this? Do I believe there is a will of God? Do I believe that there's a revelatory religious level solution to this? Do I believe, are there principles that apply to this? How about my relationship and connection to others, my service to and love for others? All these philosophical things, all of these theological things, all of these spiritual things, you lead with that. That becomes the context in which you're looking at the rest of this. What are your priorities? What is most important for you? And what are your values? When you have this philosophical context, then you go into logic. Especially when you're going to do that advanced Ben Franklin that I just talked about. The philosophy informs what goes on the list and what should be ignored. The philosophy will inform the value of the things on the list. So if you're looking at $100,000 job, why? Because I can get stuff. Well, depending on your philosophical perspective, that stuff might be critically important, or that stuff might be irrelevant. How important is stuff? Now, you can't answer that question for anyone but you. For some people, stuff is critically important, because it depends on the stuff. So what if the stuff is $100,000? I can get a safe car for my wife to drive the kids in. Is that a pretty important stuff? I can get a new car that'll be reliable and under warranty for my wife to drive the kids in. On one hand, is that stuff? Yeah. Is that materialistic stuff? It's material. But the motive behind it, driven by the philosophy, I want my family to be safe. I want them to get around everywhere they need to go safely and reliably in a vehicle I can trust. Would that be reasonable stuff? If someone says, we can buy a house. What kind of house? A cool house, because I want a cool house. What if it's like, I want to buy a nice, comfortable home for my family in a good neighborhood with a good school, so I know my children will be safe and they'll be able to be well educated. Again, is that stuff? Yeah, that's still stuff. Is that material stuff? Yeah, it's material stuff. Would you say that's being materialistic? I would say probably not. A safe, reliable car, a nice home that's comfortable in a nice neighborhood where everything works. I'd say all these are very lofty goals. Even spiritual level, material things that are being sought. Whether someone just, because I want a cool car, because I want to look cool when I drive down the road. Well, okay, maybe a little bit more materialistic there. And so on and so forth. But you lead with philosophy, then you go logic, and the philosophy informs the logic. It informs the logic as to what has value and what doesn't, as to what are the key priorities and what aren't, as to how you make this calculation and the value you ascribe to the elements as you make the calculation. And then you go into emotion. How do I feel about all of this? Now you have your broad philosophy, you lead there, you've looked at it logically with the philosophy informing the logic, and then the philosophy and the logic combine to inform the emotion. So your first reaction might be, oh, I don't know if I want that job, because, you know, that's a lot. But when you look at it from a philosophical logic level, like, well, you know, this is going to do a lot of good stuff. So if you go into the job and you're thinking, a 2-hour commute each way, why am I doing a 2-hour commute each way? Because home for my children, nice neighborhood, good education, safety, a reliable car. This is why I'm doing it. I am providing for my family. And that can inform the emotions. Like, well, and then what are your alternatives? Well, I've got this other job down here. It's a minimum wage job at McDonald's, and I'd be working the cashier. And they promised me they'd give me at least 16 hours a week. You know, okay, so your two choices job-wise is you've got a McDonald's job that you can walk to for 16 plus hours a week at minimum wage, or you have a $100,000 an hour job you can go to. You need to put these on a menu of options and look at them. How you feel about them might shift. Now, some people, emotionally, they'd much rather honestly not be working. Now, this is the nasty catch-22 sometimes people create for themselves. They double-bind themselves. Because if one of the things, say, you know, we'll go back to this dad scenario, that he's been doing while he's been unemployed looking for work is he's been connecting with his kids more. He's been helping out at home more. He's been connecting with his wife more. And now, this job means I'm going to lose my wife, I'm going to lose my kids, I'm going to lose my home because I'm going to be gone all the time. I'm going to be gone there 60 hours a week. I don't want to be gone 60 hours a week. And suddenly he feels like he's losing. And the kids could feel like they're losing. Well, we had Dad. Now Dad's gone. We used to have fun with Dad. And the wife was saying, you know, just, my husband used to be around. He used to help out at home. Now he's never even home. You know, he's gone before 7 a.m. And so he's gone before the kids have to be at school, so he can't help drop the kids off like he used to. He's gone at work when he used to help pick up the kids from school and get them to their karate classes and their soccer games and all their other activities. He doesn't get home until 7 o'clock at night, and when he does, he's exhausted, and so he's no good to me anywhere around the house Monday through Friday, and that leaves Saturday and Sunday, and then Sunday we have church in the morning, and we do brunch afterwards, and then, you know, he's tired already, and so really all we have now is Saturday and half of Sunday, when we used to have 6.5 days a week. And this gets to be sometimes a double bind again. And his part, he might have enjoyed the downtime, enjoyed the relaxation time. Besides just connecting time when, you know, his wife is at her work and the kids are at school, and just think, you know, I get to relax. I get to, you know, catch up on some of these programs that I always wanted to watch and never had time, and I'm going to stream them and kind of, you know, just dive in and catch these things and kind of putter around the garden and plant some flowers and kind of do all these things I always wanted to do, I never had time to do, and now he's got to go work. So now he feels I'm losing all this pleasure because he indulged himself in his downtime. And so these are all things that need to be factored in when you're looking at the emotion. That's why you lead with the philosophy, and then you use the logic informed by the philosophy, and then come to the emotion of, in context of my values, my priorities, my principles, all those philosophical, theological, spiritual things, and all of this information, all of this calculation, weighted based upon the philosophy, informing the emotion. So however you feel about it, you already have the big picture, You have the calculation informing your emotions. So if he begins to realize, but I really don't want to. And what he might realize is, honestly, he just doesn't really want to work. He's kind of been enjoying the downtime. He enjoys being the dad that can be there to play with his kids. He enjoys dropping them off and picking them up and taking them to their stuff. He enjoys being around to run errands. He likes this lifestyle. The problem being, the lifestyle isn't going to support his family. And he has an opportunity now to support his family. And if it comes from philosophy and logic, that will adjust his emotion. If he comes straight to emotion, his first reaction is going to be to recoil from it, and then use logic to justify it, and maybe even use logic to try to develop some philosophical principles to make it sound like a smart idea for him to reject this job. And then you balance in any survival issues. When your emotion is informed by philosophy and logic, and your survival is informed by emotions that flow from logic and philosophy, informed by the logic that flows from the philosophy, and informed by the philosophy, all the spiritual things, then you can evaluate, is this really a survival need? That first recoil, he could even make that decision at the survival level, like, I like being this dad. I like being the dad that drops his kids off. I like being the dad that picks the kids up. I like being the dad that hears about the day of school. I like being the dad that helps with the homework. I like being the dad that is at home with my kids. I like being that dad. That dad's going to die if I take this job. And he could just recoil at that. Or if he'd been an entrepreneur before, this is something I could totally relate to. If he's always seen himself as an entrepreneur, he's always seen himself as a business person, he's always seen himself as a man who works for himself, and now this is a job. And he's always seen a job as somehow beneath him. That he's supposed to be the leader, he's supposed to be the innovator, he's supposed to be the creator. And now this is just going to be a job. It's going to be a dead-end job. I'm going to be shackled to a desk. Be working for someone else, working on someone else's dreams, making someone else rich. Even though he was never really working on his own dreams, and he certainly wasn't making himself rich. If he was, he wouldn't be in this situation. And you see how if you come right into the survival need, he could end up making a really bad decision. If he comes straight through survival to emotion, he could make a really bad decision. Now, sometimes survival makes a great decision, because it's live or die, and it helps you live, it helps you not die. Emotion, it's a default setting that works on this pleasure pain. The purpose of the emotion is, let's avoid the damage, and let's pursue the good stuff. Let's avoid the pain and get the pleasure. On the broadest philosophical level, that's what you want to do. Avoid the stuff that's going to mess stuff up, and go to the things that are going to build stuff up. But you do it on an emotional level, it's very much in the moment. It's very much reactive. Logic can look at it in a slightly bigger picture than that, but it's calculative. It doesn't do values. It doesn't do philosophy. It doesn't do theology. It does calculation. And philosophy is where you get your values on. So if you can balance all four of these and do them in order. Now, it's not that you go to philosophy and stop. You go to philosophy. What are my values? What are my priorities? What are my principles? What are the spiritual things that apply to God, religion, principles, others? What are some good choices? So if my will is going to choose, then I need to lay out my choices. What is the context in which I am making this choice? And then go to the logic. You don't ignore the logic. You have to go to the logic. And then once you have all that, then you have to go to the emotion. Based upon the philosophy and based upon the logic, how do I feel about all of this? Not necessarily just this one moment, all of this in this context. And then is there anything that's going to be a live or die in it? Now, what if he likes being that dad? Like, okay, well, what is core to being that dad? Can you be that dad if you're not the one dropping your kid off to school? What if you define that? Well, I like the dad that drops his kids off to school. The next upper level question is, why? Well, I like driving with people in my car and letting them out. Probably not, right? There's something about connecting time. Like, okay, so what is a Saturday version of that you could do? Can you still be giving your kids right? Can you have connecting time with your kids? It's just not in the morning and after school. What is it about that that makes you feel so cool as a dad? And then what is another version of that that you can do? Well, I just like being able to talk to them. Well, do they have phones? Well, yeah. Well, but the youngest one, yeah. Okay, is there anything stopping you from chatting with your kids while you're driving to work? Is there a speakerphone you could be on while your wife drops them off at work so you can chat with all of them and say, hey, kids, have a great day. Learn good stuff at school and have the same conversation that you used to have when you dropped them off. Could you do something like that? Could you call your family while you're on your way back and visit with your family during your commute back home? And when you begin to look at, okay, well, it's just not the same. Well, of course it's not the same. It's the difference between a long-distance relationship and a up-close relationship. It's not supposed to be the same any more than receiving unemployment or working at McDonald's is the same as having a $100,000 a year job. It's not supposed to be the same. It's supposed to be how much of it can you continue to capture even though. And if he begins to realize there's ways to do this, then he can start to restructure the way he's going to handle his 2-hour commute. He can start to restructure the way he's going to handle some of the budgeting of his time and his energy, not just the money. To be able to be as much of that dad and to capture the heart of being that dad. To capture the heart of being that husband. You know, I always liked being the husband that was helping out with the chores around the house. Because, you know, when my wife was working and I wasn't working, you know, I did all of it. And I felt pretty satisfied that, you know, the kids would leave and things would be in a disaster, and 2 hours later, it looks great. Maybe it's not as clean as hypothetically it might possibly be able to be, but it looks good. It's all straightened up. I like that. It's like, okay, well, if you like that, and your wife really doesn't like having to clean up because when she gets home, she's bringing kids home, which means the mess makers are there at the same time she's trying to straighten up. That doesn't really usually work that well. Well, good, then you're making $100,000 a year at this new job. Can you get a housekeeper to come in once a week to help with the chores, to help run some laundry, to help do the cleaning, to free her up, to get someone in there that'll cost you, out of this $100,000 a year you're making, it might cost you $50, $100 a week, depending how much work needs to be done. To come in and spend a part of a day or an entire day there and just handle household stuff. Can you get a gardener to come in and handle the garden stuff? If you're going to be suddenly making $100,000 a year, that's $50 an hour working full time as opposed to minimum wage for 16 hours at McDonald's after your unemployment runs out. Now this is going to give you a chance to make sure your wife is alleviated as lovingly the same way as though you did it yourself, but now you're doing it with your money, and you're doing it with money that took you 2 hours to earn. And so you see how when you said we come at these things and you can dive into survival, but you dive into it from the top instead of come into it at the bottom. When you come into it at the bottom, you're very reactive. When you come to it from the top, you're very philosophical. You're thinking. And you're kind of feeling your way through for the important parts to pull up. This is the part that feels most important to me. Now, those parts, that they were nice, but you know, it's not that big of a deal. These parts were the most important ones that I can still do. Now you may find, okay, this was important to me, I really like this, but there's no version of it I can do. Well, okay, well, it's got to go, because there's just nothing I can do about it. But these parts, I can capture this much of this cool dad and husband identity that I loved so much during that 6 months I was unemployed. Now, something to keep in mind when you're looking at any kind of a perceived menu is the perceived menu may be at variance with the real menu. The perceived menu, that menu that you're aware of, that menu you perceive, the menu you think is your menu, may be at variance, meaning it's different than the real menu. You might think there's some options on your list that really shouldn't be on your list at all. You might not be aware of options, and this is a big one. You might not be aware of options you do have because you don't see them in a clear, obvious sort of way. So, using our dad's scenario again, he might not have thought 2 minutes about how much of this can I still capture? What version of it can I still do? Can I still capture some of that interaction part, even if I can't be there? Modern technology, sure you can. So, can I still capture the alleviating my wife of the burdens of the household? Well, yeah, I can do that with a housekeeper. I can do that with a gardener. The stuff that I was doing that I just kind of putter around at, I could be paying someone maybe a little over minimum wage to come help out with those things. Even if you're paying someone 2 or 3 times minimum wage. If you got a $100,000 an hour job and you don't have time to do those things and you have the money to hire someone. That's part of the proper purpose of money, is to live a lifestyle. And you're providing an income opportunity, a work opportunity for someone else who is looking for a job. You're providing them a contract for housekeeping. You're providing them a contract for gardening, a contract for pool care, whatever it is you need. If you have the wealth and the resources to hire someone and you don't like doing it anyway. It's just like you're going to these companies. You're asking them, will you do things that creates work for people to do that you'll pay them for? And then pay them. If you have the money to do that, you're making the profits. Well, same thing on a micro level. So if you're the business, if you've got the money, what can you do that will provide employment to other people in a loving way? That takes care of the housekeeper to take care of your wife. That takes care of the garden to take care of your home. Takes care of the pool to take care of your kid's swimming area. So your perceived menu may be at variance with the real menu. You have to expand your thinking. Now, you also may think things are options that don't. You go, well, hey, yeah, I could just go work at McDonald's. Like, okay, 16 hours a week, minimum wage. Is that going to pay any of your bills? Should that be on your menu of options when you have much, much better paying jobs available on your menu of options? That you're going to go somewhere where you're going to make $4,000 a year and you're going to turn down $100,000 a year when your family only needs 60. This is going to make 100, and say that's your take-home pay. So that's not just going to be surviving and feeding all of your kids and taking care of them where they're at. That's going to be that newer, safer car. That's going to be they maybe move into a newer, safer neighborhood. That's going to be maybe actually having your first big family vacation ever. That's going to be saving up for retirement. That's going to be saving up for college. There's all kinds of things that does. But, $4,000 to $8,000 a year over at McDonald's as a cashier part-time, that's not going to cut it. How long is that going to take before you're wiped out? And where is that going to land you? So to get to everything that is on your menu, here's your ideal. Always have a plan to create more options. Always have a plan to create more options. We may fixate on one option with a yes-no approach. It's either plan A or it's not plan A, and that's the only thing we see. We either see we go with plan A or we don't go with plan A. And very often when people are in survival mode, that's all they see. Is either I kill myself or I don't kill myself. I destroy my business or I don't destroy my business. That I get completely destroyed in this relationship or I survive. And this whole plan A or not plan A thing tends to anchor at the survival level, but it can also anchor at the emotional level, where all you're aware of is a do or a don't. If you get stuck in the I have to but I can't, that's a survival double bind. I have to but I can't. That's crazy making. At the emotional level, I want to but I don't want to. I do but I don't. I should but I shouldn't. I know I probably ought to but I really don't want to. That's at the emotion level. At the logic level, you can even get stuck if you only have one plan. Like, well, logically, I see all the things that this can accomplish. It's also going to cost this, and the cost and the benefit, and it kind of balances out. Not really sure. Better is to have plan A, plan B, plan C. Like, okay, we could do this, we could do that, or we could do this other thing. We've got plan A, we've got plan B, we've got plan C. We have choices. There's things we can do. But it's a limited set of options. So no matter our perceived options, one more option should always be added. Create more options. So if you have plan A or not plan A, well, you have plan A, and you have plan B is to develop more choices. You have plan A, plan B, plan C. Then you have plan D, which is create more choices. That whatever your final one is, if you get on plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G, then plan H is create more options. So if you're working through your things like, okay, well, none of these seem to really be working out, so now we're down to, plan T, create more options. Like, well, we already created more options. That's how we got all the way down to plan S. All right, well, create more options. Create plan U, plan B, plan W, plan X, plan Y, plan Z. 26 plans. Something's got to work. All right, now we're going to start numbering them. And you just keep going. So one of the ways you create more options is to brainstorm. It's one of the easiest ways to create more options. Now, brainstorming is just you come up with 20 or more ideas, and there's something here called the silly 7. Now, when you're coming up with the 20 ideas, that's not meaning you're coming up with plans, A through whatever the 20th letter of the alphabet is. It means that you're coming up with a whole bunch of ideas, and from those, you're going to draw or craft your plans. So when you're stuck in any decision, you can work alone or in a group, and there's a powerful dynamic if you do this with a group, and develop 20 ideas. Now, the silly 7 rule is that at least 7 of these ideas should be silly. Meaning they should be ridiculous. They should be exaggerated. They should be cartoonish. They should be comical. They should be something that just makes them silly. That there's no way you could actually do that idea. But often, a creative, brilliant, genius answer, the seed of an answer or the trigger to greater creativity, which is one of the key purposes, is found in the silly 7. And so the silly 7 allows you to kind of let go of your logic, let go of critical thinking, get creative, just let it be, whatever. Sometimes in a silly idea is the seed of genius. Sometimes, though, it is as simple as being able and willing to go to silly lets your brain break free of its rigid thinking and get a little bit more creative. Now, how does all of this apply to accepting Christ? Because accepting Christ or rejecting Christ can be a pro or con at any stage. Now, if you're already a Christian, you've already accepted Christ. What's your next step? Do you have a discipleship step? Have you developed the daily habit of reading your Bible? Have you developed the daily habit of reading or praying to God? Is this something that for you, you believe is a thing you ought to be doing? Now, if you're first going, but I don't have an hour a day, Pastor. So I'm not saying an hour a day. I'm saying 10 seconds a day. Not even 10 seconds. Read or recite one verse and say anything to God. Thank you, God, is a good start. So if you just recite one verse, Jesus wept, thank you, God. How long did that take? Like 2 seconds. That would be enough. So read or recite one verse and say anything directed to God as a daily habit. Now, if you don't believe a daily habit is important, well, that might not be something that's important to you. How about reading the Bible? How about getting through the whole Bible cover to cover at least once? Is that something that you think would be a good thing to do? Why do you or why don't you? And then you look at these things. Is there something stopping you? How about getting involved in a small group? How about doing a Bible study? How about anything in a spiritual domain? So no matter where you are, unless you have achieved perfection, is there anything where you have your next decision to make for Christ? Because accepting Christ, whether accepting is that salvation accepting, which is the core of what we're talking about, for each one of us, though, the next level of accepting the next step. Accepting Christ might be about survival, as we talked about the Muslim man in the African country. If he accepted Christ, that was going to affect the survival of his family, the survival of his business, his financial survival, his social survival, and he wasn't committed enough to be willing to die in all of those arenas. So for some people, it's about survival. If someone's always been the skeptic, they've always been the atheist, this is what they've always been. And to accept Christ for them is a huge sacrifice of their identity. It could be about survival. A lot of it can be if they perceive a package deal, whether or not that package deal actually exists. That if I become a Christian, it means I must also be all of these things. It could be a false perception of survival. Oh, I can't accept Christ because I don't want to have to go protest with those Westboro Baptist people. Now, if you're a Christian, unless you are with Westboro Baptist, that has nothing to do with accepting Christ. But they might perceive that. I don't want to align with all those pedophile priests because, I've seen that in the news. And I can't accept Christ because then I'm approving of that. Well, no. That's a false equivalency. But it could be about survival because they see a false package deal. So accepting Christ or taking the next step could be about survival, legitimately or illegitimately. This is why you want to come philosophical, logical, emotional survival. Accepting Christ might be emotional. It could be intensely emotional for someone. For most of us, when we accepted Christ, there was emotion involved. For some of us, it was relief. We felt a release from the burdens of the past. For some of us, it was this joy. For some of us, we just, collapsed in tears out of just knowing that we are forgiven by Christ and that His blood has washed away our sins. And it's intensely emotional. For some people, it's also intensely emotional, but in the other way, that they're angry about the things of the church. They're angry about the things of Christ. That maybe all they've seen in church, because they haven't been around church, is they've seen the politically active Christians, and that's their only encounter they have with Christians. And so they think church is all about politics. And they disagree with the perspective that has been pushed for the political perspectives of some of the Christians that talk about this as though this is obviously the will of God. And for them it's intensely emotional because then they think that, well, then if I accept your Christ, I'm accepting your political views. And I don't accept your political views. I think your political views are a bunch of rubbish. I'm not going there. And they reject Christ because they reject the political view of Christian political activists. So you see how so much of this can work. And again, a lot of that is the false package deal. There's no real package deal there, but it's an emotionally perceived package deal. For some, accepting Christ might be a matter of logic, and this can break either way. So when you study things from a logical, evidence-based perspective, you can land either way. Think about any court case you've ever heard of. Which of the two sides has a lawyer? That would be both. So which of the two sides believes they're making a logical presentation? That would also be both. Now, one logical presentation might be much better than the other logical presentation, of course. But what if you lived and breathed one side of this case? And now you have to look at the other side of the case and go, they actually have a point. What if you look at the other side of the case and it's very emotionally satisfying? But you've so invested yourself in this side that to look at that and go, I don't know if I'm ready to go there. I want to, but I don't know if I'm that convinced. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. Now, the odd thing sometimes is they might have a lot of unanswered questions in their own side. So if someone was over here trying to be logically convinced to step over there, there's not enough to make them move over there, but there's enough here that they don't want to go the other way. Because there's one level of information you need to satisfy yourself that where you are is a good place. It's a different level of information you need to change. and probably the military numbers on that are pretty good, that if you have an entrenched foe, that they are locked into their place, they've got their fortresses up, they've got their bases set, and they've got the perimeter established, you need about a 4-to-1 ratio to break them out of there, to win. You can defend an area with about a quarter of the force it takes to take an area and then to occupy that area. So if you think about it kind of like that, both sides can be in sufficient equilibrium because neither side has 4 times the logical force to convince the other. So sometimes people logically, they'll stay because they're committed to the scientific theory, which to them is very scientific, it's very logical, obviously. And that to them, to accept Christ means, well, then I have to kind of accept all those kind of pseudoscience, cuckoo, science rejecting sort of, I can't do that. Again, the false package deal. And accepting Christ might be very philosophical, a pre-existing religion, a spiritual philosophy, in either direction. And so for us, I mean, this has to do with someone accepting or rejecting Christ as Savior, but for us, accepting or rejecting our next step with Christ, it's the same thing. And we come at it now with this understanding. Okay, philosophically, will of God, religious life, principles, others, what's our values, what's our priorities, as we come the biggest possible picture, what is our philosophical, theological view we're going to come into this, to look at the logic of the choices that we're making. And then to let that philosophy and let that logic inform our emotions. And then when we have our philosophy and logic informing our emotions, when our emotions are at variance with our own stated philosophy and our own logical calculations, we know that something's wrong. There's something else going on there that's worth taking note of. Not ignore, take note of it and consider exploring. What does this mean? And then look at survival. And chances are some of it's connected to survival, but a lot of it could also be connected to principles you kind of don't want to admit to yourself you really still live by. So decisions. What's your next step? What's my next step? Can I step beyond survival, beyond emotion, beyond logic, and begin at the philosophy? And from the philosophical perspective, let that inform the logic of how do I execute my spiritual values? How do I execute the will of God? How do I execute my priorities, my responsibilities? How do I execute all that and calculate how to do it logically? What is it? What's the cost? What's the benefit? How do I weight this logically informed by the philosophy for everything in your life? Specifically right now we're talking about your spiritual step, the next step. And as you inform that logically, then how does all of that affect your emotions? How do you feel about that? And what's still at variance with that? If you're still angry about some of that, all right, there's still a broken rule thing going on in there. Some of it scares you, all right, there's something you don't feel ready for, that's all mixed up in there. And then let that then pour down to survival and say, okay, so as that affects our survival needs, what is the I can'ts, and what is the I have to's, and what are the versions that you can still do? Can you still capture enough to be that dad? Can you still live a life that's Muslim enough to not alienate everybody, but have accepted Jesus Christ in your heart as your Savior, while still protecting your family and protecting your finances so your family can eat, and have a roof over their head, and have clothes on their back? Is there a way to do that? You know, depending who the missionary is talking to them, if it was a QX-style missionary, well, then we would say, of course you can do that. If you accept Christ as your personal Savior, you have salvation. You can pursue your discipleship privately. And you can protect your Muslim practices as you learn more about Christ. That you don't have to reject Christ because of this. You can accept Him as your Savior, and then as things move forward, see if there's another way to structure it slowly and steadily. So as you take your next step with Jesus as your Lord, take the next step in a way that takes care of your family. Because accepting Christ as your Savior is that line. That's a bright, clear line. And after that, it's about getting better. It's about taking steps. You don't have to instantly destroy your life, but you can instantly save your soul. And then work on slowly and systematically perhaps restructuring your life to allow you to live as Christ's disciple. And let this be a beginning rather than let it be a package deal that's going to do a lot of damage. Because accepting Christ as your Savior, that's not going to damage anything. But you perceive that it will. And for the rest, we can work on that. But if you're convinced, it's time to take the next step. And as for the rest, those are next steps after the next step. And we'll work on that. Decisions, decisions. A selection from a perceived menu of options. We tend to default to survival, emotion, and then logic. We very rarely make it to logic. We usually make the decision to survival or emotion. Almost never make it to philosophy. And now we know the way to do it is begin with philosophy and balance it with them to logic and emotion and survival. This is Scott Conway at QX Church. Decisions, decisions, lesson number 4. Thank you.